What I'm trying to say is that this negative attitude towards ourselves become normalized, and they may translate into, oh, we have nothing, we have no originality. So that even when an educated African person may have a PhD, he may still not have the confidence that arises from knowing that that PhD is somehow also arises from his entire relation to his own culture and languages and so on. In other words, he sees that PhD, that achievement, as a tribute to his connection with European languages and cultures and so on. Of course, I want to add very, very emphatically that there's nothing wrong in any person knowing as many languages as possible. And it's very important for people to be very effective in whatever language is the language of power. What is basically wrong in terms of policies and personal practices is to assume that one's own language and cultures have nothing to give. It should be the other way around is what's more empowering. You know your own language, then you add as many languages as you can to that language and so on. So that way you are empowered. But the other way around is one of enslavement. Because when you know many languages in the world and you have no idea about your own language and so on, you are shut out of the community.
Right.
Then to me that seems to be enslavement.
Now, in this book you said that the African Renaissance began at the historical moment, which was a catalyst to resistance movements across the continent, movements like the Mau Mau in Kenya, the ANC in South Africa, and many others around the continent. And you talk about the turning point of Afro-modernity being the 1945 Manchester Congress, which you say provided a momentum to the 50s and the 60s liberation movements. What would you say happened to those movements in the subsequent years, the 80s and the 90s?
The idea of Africa, when Europeans first came, or colonizers came to our own countries, we fought against them as individual communities. So, if it's a Yoruba, they fought against the colonial invasions as Yorubas and so on. But once we were occupied, there came a moment when we were no longer struggling against the colonial presence as individual linguistic communities, but rather as all the communities in a given territory. Mm-hmm. Not even that, we began to think ourselves in terms of a continent of African peoples. So whether we're in Kenya or South Africa or West Africa, we talked about Africa, okay? So that's what I mean when the idea of Africa begins to be the organizing principle.
It becomes a collective, right?
Yeah, it becomes a collective. We are now where we moved a higher level. And not only that, it's very interesting that that idea of Africa, as I tried to explain in the book, in a way was born abroad by those Africans who were already detached from the continent through enslavement, because they could think of Africa as a whole. So Marcus Garvey could talk about Africa for Africans at home and abroad, for instance. Du Bois and others could also talk about Africa as a whole. And that idea of Africa then also becomes an organizing force in nationalist anti-colonial struggles. ANC called itself African National Congress, and there are many others who call themselves national conventions or congresses also all over Africa. So this is what I'm talking about, the idea of Africa becoming an organizing force. And when I say that the African Renaissance has begun, I'm including the whole question and practices, the whole anti-colonial movement, because that's very, very important. And the achievement of independence was a monumental gate, obviously. But it's only one stage in a process, okay? It's as if we got independence. We're going to go through the next two stages of national, in a way, liberation from a sense of being dependent on others, and also the stage of social revolution within our own societies so that our people really, really are at the basis and they are also the objective of development. So I see the African Renaissance as something which is continuous, which is going on all the time.
Now, you talk about language as one of the most important aspects of our heritage. What are the dangers to this heritage when we see the African middle class with a somewhat negative attitude or perception to our languages? Also, what happens to the African experience, quote unquote, African experience, when we leave the continent and become part of this wider African diaspora?
Being outside here can also have also positive, okay, because one they can see, wait a minute, so this is what Africa means to me, or this is what I'm missing of Africa, and so on. Okay, so one can see one's kind of a better perspective of one's relationship to Africa. And also, quite frankly, one can also begin to see Africa as a whole.
And we stop seeing ourselves in these community silos and more as a collective.
Exactly. So, distance can also help, quite frankly. And that's another thing, that we need more. When I talk of African languages, it doesn't mean that we shut ourselves in the languages. In other words, we use the language as a base from which we interact with other languages and cultures in the world.
I guess the main challenge is, how do we connect with our own languages on the same level as we do the other languages, the foreign languages?
Exactly. I agree with you. And that's a problem, And the question you raise, what happens to Africa then when its elite begins to negate African languages? Now, it just means, quite frankly, and I'm sorry to say this, that in some identity, there will be no Africa of tomorrow. We shall be there physically as Africans, but we shall become part, in that identity, we shall simply become part of the English language-speaking communities, part of French-speaking communities. In other words, technically, we shall become a community of those who speak French, Frenchmen, those who speak English, Englishmen.
So colonization will have come full circle then?
In the terms of identity, yes, yeah. Because we shall be calling ourselves, even when we call ourselves Africans, it really is like misnomer when we are entirely an English language-speaking community or a French language-speaking community, because language makes us be more part of that language community than the other way around. Language and identity are very, very important, but not identity as a way of saying I enclose myself within that identity, but identity as the base for interacting freely, creatively with other identities.
Would you say that language is a thought process or an expression? For example, using myself as an example, I speak multiple languages, including my mother tongue, but I think that my thought process is primarily in English. Does it matter if I can speak my mother tongue perfectly, but also have an Anglo-Saxon way of expressing myself and processing information?
It matters two things here. First of all, it matters. Obviously, when you have got a language, at least that's a beginning, very, very important. But also to remember that the reason why we think that the thought process is more so in English or French is because, quite simply, we are used to conceptualizing ideas in English or French and so on. In other words, even when you are in school, like the school you mentioned, when people are trying to discuss ideas or write ideas or read about ideas, they did all those things in English in this case. Okay? So it's not surprising, it's not surprising then that when one comes to think of ideas later on which to build, one thinks in English and so on. But it can also happen the other way around, that the more used we are to African languages, the more we shall be thinking within, or we shall be thinking within those languages as well, or out of those languages.
Professor Thiong'o, thank you very much. It's
great. Nice talking to you. And
it was good to talk to you too.
Yeah, call me anytime, okay?
Sure.